The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, and I knew it was trouble before I even opened it because nobody sends good news via certified mail. I'm Oliver Hayes, and I've lived in the Riverside Meadows subdivision in Henderson, Nevada for the past 8 years. The envelope had the HOA logo stamped on it, which made my stomach sink because I'd been careful to follow every single one of their ridiculous rules since moving in. I tore open the envelope while standing in my kitchen, still wearing my work clothes from the municipal water department, where I'd just been promoted to water commissioner 3 months ago. The promotion had been a big deal, a culmination of 15 years working my way up through the system, but apparently the HOA board hadn't gotten that particular memo. The fine was for $250. The violation. My decorative fountain in the front yard had frozen over during the cold snap we'd experienced the previous week. And according to HOA President Sharon Whitmore, this constituted an eyesore and a violation of Section 12.4 of the Homeowner's Covenant regarding proper maintenance of decorative yard features. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. The fountain had been professionally installed 2 years ago with full HOA approval. I had the paperwork in my filing cabinet to prove it. During the installation, I'd even upgraded the pump system and added proper drainage because I knew exactly how water systems worked. But what Sharon Whitmore apparently didn't know was that Henderson had experienced temperatures below freezing for 5 consecutive nights, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. The fountain had frozen despite the heating element I'd installed, which was only rated for brief cold snaps, not sustained freezing temperatures. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA management office immediately. A cheerful voice answered after 3 rings. Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Patricia speaking. How may I help you? This is Oliver Hayes on Cottonwood Drive. I just received a fine in the mail that makes absolutely no sense. My fountain froze during the cold snap last week, which was beyond my control, and now I'm being charged $250. Patricia's voice shifted from cheerful to cautious. Let me pull up your file, Mr. Hayes. Just one moment, please. I waited, drumming my fingers on the granite countertop. Through my kitchen window, I could see the fountain in question. It had thawed completely now that temperatures were back in the 60s, and the water was flowing perfectly again. The whole thing looked immaculate. Yes, Mr. Hayes, I see the violation here. The fine was issued by Mrs. Whitmore during her neighborhood inspection on January 15th. The notes indicate that the frozen fountain presented an unsightly appearance and could potentially damage the property value of surrounding homes. Patricia, it was frozen because of the weather. The same weather that froze everyone's outdoor faucets and pipes. Should I have stood outside with a hairdryer for 5 days straight? I understand your frustration, sir, but the covenant is clear that all decorative features must be maintained in pristine condition year-round. Year-round maintenance doesn't include controlling the weather, Patricia. I'm just reading what the policy states, Mr. Hayes. If you'd like to dispute the fine, you'll need to appear before the HOA board at the next meeting. That's scheduled for next Thursday at 7 in the evening at the community center. I hung up after getting the specific details, already planning what I'd say at that meeting. Sharon Whitmore had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved in. She was the type of HOA president who drove around the neighborhood with a clipboard, measuring grass height with a ruler, and photographing any minor deviation from the extensive list of rules. She tried to fine me once before for parking my work truck in my driveway overnight, claiming it was a commercial vehicle. I'd fought that one-on-one by pointing out that the truck was a standard pickup with a small municipal logo, no different than if someone worked for a private company and drove a branded vehicle home. The next morning, I drove to work still fuming about the fine. The municipal water department building sat near downtown Henderson, a modern facility that controlled water distribution for over 300,000 residents. My new office on the third floor had a view of the valley and the distant mountains, and my title of water commissioner came with significant responsibilities. I oversaw water quality, distribution systems, emergency protocols, and conservation efforts for the entire city. My assistant, Frank Martinez, knocked on my door around 9. He'd worked in the department for 20 years and knew the systems better than anyone. "Morning, Oliver. Got the reports you wanted on the freeze damage from last week." I waved him in. "How bad was it? Could have been worse." We had about 200 reports of burst pipes, mostly in older neighborhoods. The newer subdivisions with updated building codes fared better. Riverside Meadows only had 3 incidents. Speaking of Riverside Meadows, did you know my HOA just fined me because my fountain froze during the cold snap? Frank laughed, then realized I was serious. "Wait, really? That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week. How were you supposed to prevent that?" "Apparently, I should have magically controlled the weather. I have to go to their board meeting next week to dispute it." "You know what's ironic?" Frank leaned against the doorframe. "We actually issued a city-wide advisory telling people to shut off their outdoor water features during the freeze warning. It's in our emergency protocols. So technically, you could have been violating city code if you'd kept it running and the pipes burst." That caught my attention. "Do we have documentation of that advisory?" "Of course. It went out through the emergency notification system, social media, and the local news. We documented everything in case there were liability issues." An idea began forming in my mind. "Frank, can you pull all the documentation from that cold snap? Every advisory we issued, the temperature records, everything." "Sure thing. Planning to fight this HOA fine. I'm planning to educate them about how water systems actually work." Over the next few days, I assembled a comprehensive file. The National Weather Service data showed Henderson hit 28 degrees for 5 consecutive nights, the longest cold snap since 2012. Our department had issued 3 separate advisories recommending residents shut down outdoor water features, drain exposed pipes, and take precautions. I had time-stamped emails, social media posts, and even a recording of the radio announcement. I also pulled up the original installation permits for my fountain. Everything had been done to code, with licensed contractors and proper inspections. The system included a recirculating pump, proper drainage, and a heating element rated for occasional freezing temperatures. No residential fountain system was designed to handle sustained below freezing conditions while continuing to operate. It would be wasteful and potentially dangerous. Thursday evening arrived, and I put on slacks and a button-down shirt before heading to the community center. The building sat at the entrance to Riverside Meadows, a Spanish-style structure that hosted various neighborhood events. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the meeting room already half full. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I waved to while getting mail or walking my dog. Sharon Whitmore sat at the head table with 4 other board members. She was in her mid-50s, with blonde hair styled in that demanding to speak to the manager cut, and wore a purple blazer that probably cost more than my fountain. She looked up when I entered, and her expression tightened. "Mr. Hayes, I assume you're here about your fine." "That's right, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm scheduled to speak during the dispute portion of the meeting." "We'll get to that in due course. Please take a seat." The meeting started with standard business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the annual budget, debating whether to resurface the tennis courts. I sat patiently, my folder of documentation on my lap, while Sharon droned on about upcoming neighborhood events and reminders about trash can placement rules. Finally, she consulted her agenda. We have one dispute on the docket tonight. Mr. Oliver Hayes of 847 Cottonwood Drive is contesting a fine issued for improper maintenance of a decorative fountain. Mr. Hayes, you have 5 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the small podium set up for residents. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Members of the board, I'm here because I received a $250 fine for a frozen fountain during the recent cold snap. I believe this fine is not only unjust, but demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how water systems work and what constitutes reasonable maintenance. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. This is the National Weather Service data for Henderson from January 10th through January 16th. As you can see, we experienced sustained below freezing temperatures for 5 consecutive nights, reaching as low as 28 degrees. This type of extended freeze is rare for our area and hasn't occurred since 2012. Sharon's expression remained stern. Mr. Hayes, the weather conditions are irrelevant. The covenant requires that decorative features be maintained in pristine condition. A frozen fountain is not pristine. I disagree that weather conditions are irrelevant, but let me continue. This next document is from the City of Henderson Municipal Water Department, where I work as the water commissioner. I saw a few board members exchange glances at that title. During the freeze period, my department issued 3 separate advisories recommending that residents shut down all outdoor water features, drain exposed pipes, and take protective measures. Running a fountain during sustained freezing temperatures risks burst pipes, water damage, and system failure. I handed copies to each board member. You'll note the timestamps on these advisories. The first went out on January 9th before the freeze began. Following these professional recommendations, I shut down my fountain, drained the basin, and covered the pump housing. However, residual water in the decorative portion of the fountain froze, which is normal and unavoidable. Once temperatures rose again, everything thawed naturally, and the fountain resumed normal operation with 0 damage. One of the other board members, an older man named Robert, spoke up. So you're saying you actually did exactly what you were supposed to do? Precisely. The fountain is currently operating perfectly, as anyone can verify by driving past my home. There was no damage, no maintenance issue, and no actual violation of any reasonable interpretation of the covenant. Mrs. Whitmore simply photographed naturally occurring ice during historically cold weather and decided it was a violation. Sharon's face reddened. The covenant doesn't make exceptions for weather, Mr. Hayes. If we allow frozen fountains, what's next? Dead plants because of a drought. Faded paint because of the sun. Dead plants from drought are actually covered under our city's water conservation ordinances, which supersede HOA rules, I replied calmly. And paint fading over time is normal wear, not a maintenance violation. But a fountain freezing during freezing weather isn't even a maintenance issue. It's physics. Water freezes at 32 degrees. My fountain experienced temperatures below that for 5 days. Expecting it not to freeze is like expecting the sun not to shine. Another board member, a woman in her 40s named Margaret, looked at the documents I'd provided. These city advisories are pretty clear. Mr. Hayes, did you have any damage to your fountain system? None whatsoever, because I followed proper procedures and shut it down before the freeze. If I'd left it running, trying to prevent ice from forming, I could have burned out the pump, burst pipes, or created an electrical hazard. Sharon wasn't backing down. The rule is clear. Decorative features must be maintained in pristine condition. I drive through this neighborhood every week, Mr. Hayes, and your fountain was an icy mess for 5 days. It had some ice in it during a freeze, just like every bird bath, pond, and water feature in the entire city. That's not a mess, Mrs. Whitmore. That's weather. And issuing fines for weather is absurd. The tension in the room was palpable. Several residents watching the exchange whispered to each other. Sharon glared at me, clearly not used to having her decisions challenged so directly. Robert spoke again. I think Mr. Hayes makes a good point. We can't reasonably expect people to control the weather. And if the city itself recommended shutting down water features, then he was following official guidance. The HOA covenant supersedes city recommendations, Sharon snapped. We have standards to maintain. City emergency advisories actually do supersede HOA rules in many cases, I said quietly. That's established law. HOAs can't require actions that violate municipal codes or ignore official emergency guidance. And speaking of city codes, my fountain is in full compliance with all plumbing codes, electrical codes, and water use regulations. I have the inspection certificates if anyone wants to review them. Margaret looked at Sharon. I move that we dismiss this fine. Mr. Hayes clearly took appropriate action during unusual weather conditions, and there's no actual violation here. I second that motion, Robert added immediately. Sharon looked furious. We haven't finished discussing this. I think we have, Margaret said firmly. Mr. Hayes provided clear documentation that he followed professional guidance during an emergency weather situation. The fountain is undamaged and operating properly now. There's no basis for a fine. All in favor of dismissing the fine. 3 hands went up immediately. The fourth board member, a quiet man who hadn't spoken yet, raised his hand after a moment's hesitation. Sharon sat with her arms crossed, the only dissenting vote. Motion passes 4-1, Margaret announced. The fine is dismissed. Mr. Hayes, thank you for your thorough presentation. I gathered my documents, nodding to the board. Thank you for your time. As I turned to leave, Sharon's voice rang out sharply. This isn't over, Mr. Hayes. I'll be watching your property very carefully from now on. One violation, one blade of grass too long, one trash can left out 5 minutes too late and you'll be right back here. I paused and turned back to face her. The entire room had gone silent. Mrs. Whitmore, I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years. I maintain my property meticulously. I pay my dues on time, and I follow reasonable rules. But I won't be intimidated by threats of harassment. If you want to measure my grass with a ruler, go ahead. You'll find it's exactly within the specified range. If you want to photograph my trash cans, be my guest. They're stored in my garage except on collection days. And if you want to issue bogus fines because you don't like being challenged, I'll dispute every single one with the same level of documentation I brought tonight. Someone in the audience actually applauded. Sharon's face turned an alarming shade of red. This meeting is adjourned, she announced abruptly, slamming her gavel down. I walked out feeling vindicated but also knowing I'd made an enemy. Sharon Whitmore didn't strike me as the type to let this go. I was right. 2 weeks later, I received another certified letter. This time the fine was for $300. The violation. Apparently, my house numbers weren't reflective enough and didn't meet the new visibility standards the board had adopted at a special meeting I hadn't been notified about. The letter included a grainy photograph taken at night showing my address numbers, which looked perfectly fine to me. I checked my mailbox, my email, and the HOA website. There had been no notification of a special meeting, no announcement of new visibility standards, and no grace period for compliance. The fine had been issued exactly 14 days after the fountain incident, which seemed awfully coincidental. This time when I called Patricia at the management office, she sounded uncomfortable. "Mr. Hayes, I see the fine in the system. The new visibility standards were adopted at a special board meeting on January 30th. I received no notice of that meeting." Don't special meetings require notification to homeowners? Typically, yes, but this was classified as an emergency meeting to address safety concerns. What safety concerns? House numbers that aren't reflective enough constitute an emergency, Patricia sighed. "Between you and me, Mr. Hayes, I think you should talk to a lawyer. I'm seeing some patterns in the system that concern me, but I can't say more than that. I'm just an employee." That was interesting. "What kind of patterns?" "I really can't discuss it." "But you're not the only one getting unusual fines lately. I'd suggest requesting full records of all HOA meetings and fine distributions for the past year. As a homeowner, you're entitled to that information." I thanked her and hung up, then immediately contacted Robert Chen, a real estate attorney I'd met at a city planning meeting. His office was in downtown Henderson, and he agreed to see me the next day. Robert's office was modern and professional, with law books lining one wall and framed degrees on another. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking notes on a legal pad. "HOAs have broad authority, but they're not above the law," he said when I finished. "What you're describing sounds like targeted harassment, possibly retaliation for challenging the board president. The timing is suspicious. The lack of notice for the special meeting is potentially a violation of Nevada HOA law, and the fact that you're being singled out with questionable fines suggests a pattern. What can I do about it?" "First, request all HOA records for the past year. Meeting minutes, financial records, fine distributions, everything. Nevada law requires HOAs to provide this information to homeowners upon request, though they can charge reasonable copying fees. Second, document everything. Every interaction with Sharon Whitmore, every fine, every communication. Third, attend every board meeting from now on. Make your presence known. You think this is going to escalate? I think you embarrassed a petty tyrant in front of her subjects, and she's going to make your life difficult until you either move away or she gets bored. People like Sharon Whitmore view HOA presidency as a personal fiefdom. They don't handle challenges well." I left Robert's office with a formal records request letter he'd drafted. That afternoon, I delivered it personally to the HOA management office. Patricia accepted it with a knowing look. "We have 30 days to compile everything," she said. "But Mr. Hayes, off the record, you might want to talk to the Johnsons on Maple Street and the Hendersons on Oak Drive. They've had similar issues lately." I found the Johnsons that evening. Mark and Linda Johnson were in their 60s, retired teachers who'd lived in Riverside Meadows for 15 years. They invited me into their immaculate home, which overlooked the community park. "We've been fined 4 times in the past 2 months, Mark said bitterly. It started after Linda attended a board meeting and questioned the budget for landscaping. Sharon didn't like being asked where the money was going. Linda showed me the fines. One for a garden gnome that was supposedly too tall. One for a welcome mat that extended 3 inches past the acceptable zone. One for a bird feeder that apparently attracted too many birds. One for parking their car on the street overnight during a snowstorm when their daughter was visiting and took the garage space. "These are ridiculous," I said, reading through them. "Garden gnomes have a height limit, According to Sharon, everything has a limit, Linda said. She adopted all these new rules at special meetings with minimal notice. Most people don't attend meetings regularly, so they don't know about the changes until they get fined. And when we disputed the fines, she denied every single one, Mark added. The other board members just go along with whatever she says. We've paid almost $1,000 in the past 2 months. The Hendersons had a similar story. Tom Henderson had questioned Sharon about maintenance fees for the community pool during a meeting, pointing out that the pool was closed more often than it was open. 2 weeks later, he was fined for having outdoor Christmas lights up past January 5th. Then fined again for a small oil stain on his driveway. Then fined for his trash can being visible from the street at 8:15 a.m. on collection day, even though collection wasn't until 9 a.m. I spent the next week talking to other homeowners. A pattern emerged. Anyone who questioned Sharon or challenged her authority soon found themselves drowning in fines for increasingly petty violations. People who kept their heads down and paid their dues were mostly left alone, though Sharon still did her regular patrols with a clipboard. The records request came back exactly 30 days later. Patricia had compiled everything into 3 large boxes. I took them home and spent an entire weekend going through them with a fine-tooth comb. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 18 months, since Sharon had been elected HOA president, fine revenue had increased by 300%. The number of special meetings had quadrupled. Dozens of new rules had been adopted, often with minimal notice, and at meetings that only 5 or 6 people attended. The landscaping budget had tripled, all going to a company called Desert Bloom Landscapes. The pool maintenance contract had been changed to a different company at twice the previous cost. But the really interesting part was that Desert Bloom Landscapes was owned by Sharon's brother-in-law, and the new pool company was owned by her cousin. I found this information through simple internet searches, cross-referencing business licenses and LLC registrations. Sharon Whitmore wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was using her position to funnel HOA money to family members through inflated contracts. The increase in fines provided extra revenue to justify the bloated budgets. Anyone who questioned the finances got targeted with harassment fines until they either shut up or moved away. I called Robert Chen immediately. "That's fraud," he said flatly. "Self-dealing, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty." Nevada has specific laws about conflicts of interest in HOA management. Board members can't award contracts to family members without full disclosure and approval from the homeowners. And using fine revenue to pad budgets for personal gain is criminal. What do I do? We need to present this to the full homeowner association, not just the board. You have the right to call a special meeting if you get signatures from 15% of homeowners. Get those signatures, call a meeting, and present the evidence. In the meantime, I'm going to send a letter to the board alerting them that we're aware of potential legal violations. The next 2 weeks were busy. I went door to door with a petition to call a special homeowner meeting. Most people signed immediately once I explained what I'd found. The Johnsons, the Hendersons, and several other families who'd been targeted by Sharon's fines helped spread the word. Within 10 days, I had signatures from 30% of the neighborhood. Robert sent his letter to the board, carefully worded but making clear that legal violations had been identified and would be addressed at the upcoming special meeting. The letter also noted that all HOA records were being reviewed for compliance with Nevada law. Sharon's response was predictable. I received 2 more fines in quick succession. One for a supposedly leaking garden hose that was wasting water. As water commissioner, I found that particularly ironic since my water usage was tracked by the city and was actually below average for my property size. The other fine was for unapproved modifications to my landscaping, specifically a small rose bush I'd planted 3 years ago with full approval from the previous HOA board. I documented both fines but didn't bother disputing them. They were obvious retaliation, and they'd only strengthen my case. The special meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in mid-March. The community center meeting room could hold about 100 people, and every seat was filled by 7 o'clock. People stood along the walls and in the doorway. This was the largest turnout for an HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. Sharon sat at the head table with the other board members, her expression thunderous. She knew something was coming but probably didn't know the full extent of what I'd uncovered. I stood at the podium with Robert beside me, several folders of documentation on the table. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "This meeting was called because serious irregularities have been discovered in the management of our HOA. Over the past 18 months, fine revenue has increased dramatically, new rules have been adopted with minimal notice, and several expensive contracts have been awarded under questionable circumstances." I pulled out the first set of documents. Let's start with Desert Bloom Landscapes. This company was awarded our landscaping contract 18 months ago, replacing the previous company we'd used successfully for years. The new contract costs 3 times what we were previously paying. What the board didn't disclose is that Desert Bloom Landscapes is owned by Sharon Whitmore's brother-in-law, David Whitmore. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sharon's face was stone. Similarly, our pool maintenance contract was changed to Aqua Solutions, owned by Sharon's cousin, Richard Chen. This contract costs twice what the previous company charged, despite the pool being closed more frequently for supposedly necessary maintenance. I distributed copies of the business license registrations and family connections to the audience. Nevada law is very clear. HOA board members cannot award contracts to family members without full disclosure to the homeowner association and a vote. No such disclosure was ever made. No vote was ever held. These contracts were approved at sparsely attended board meetings with minimal discussion. Robert stepped forward. "What Mr. Hayes has described constitutes multiple violations of Nevada HOA law, specifically conflicts of interest and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence suggests that Mrs. Whitmore has been using her position to direct HOA funds to family members for personal financial gain." Sharon finally spoke, her voice shaking with anger. "This is slander. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Those companies bid for the contracts like anyone else." "Actually, I have copies of the bid requests," I said calmly. "Or rather, the lack of them." No formal bidding process was conducted for either contract. The previous companies weren't even notified that their contracts were being reviewed. Desert Bloom and Aqua Solutions were simply awarded the contracts by board vote. Margaret, the board member who'd supported me during the fountain dispute, looked stricken. "Sharon, is this true? I don't remember voting on any contracts." "Of course it's true," Linda Johnson called out from the audience. "I've been tracking the meeting minutes." Both contracts were approved at special meetings where only Sharon and one other board member were present. The votes didn't meet quorum requirements. Sharon stood abruptly. "This is a witch hunt. Oliver Hayes is bitter because I held him accountable for covenant violations, and now he's trying to destroy my reputation. Mrs. Whitmore, I received 6 fines totaling over $1,000 in the past 2 months, all for manufactured violations or natural occurrences like weather. The Johnsons have been fined repeatedly. The Hendersons have been fined repeatedly. In fact, Every single homeowner who's questioned your decisions has suddenly found themselves buried in fines. That's called retaliation, and it's also illegal. I pulled out another document. This is a spreadsheet showing every fine issued in the past 18 months. Before you became president, we averaged about 20 fines per year for actual violations like unpaid dues or genuinely overgrown yards. In the past 18 months under your leadership, we've had over 200 fines. The fine revenue has gone from about $2,000 a year to over $30,000, and that money has been used to justify increased budgets for services provided by your family members. The room erupted in angry voices. People started shouting questions at Sharon, demanding answers. Robert raised his hands for quiet. "Here's what needs to happen," he said in a commanding voice. "First, Mrs. Whitmore needs to resign from the board immediately due to clear conflicts of interest. Second, the contracts with Desert Bloom and Aqua Solutions need to be terminated and put out for proper competitive bidding. Third, all questionable fines issued in the past 18 months need to be reviewed by an independent committee. Fourth, a full financial audit needs to be conducted by an outside firm." "I will not resign," Sharon said defiantly. "You can't force me out." "Actually, we can," Margaret said quietly. She looked at the other board members. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Sharon Whitmore as HOA president." "Seconded," Robert, the board member, said immediately. "This is outrageous." Sharon grabbed her purse. "You're all going to regret this. My lawyer will have every one of you in court." She stormed toward the door, but stopped when Tom Henderson blocked her path. "You fined me $300 because my Christmas lights were up past January 5th, he said quietly. "My wife was in the hospital that week. She'd just been diagnosed with cancer. Taking down Christmas lights wasn't exactly my priority, but you didn't care, you just wanted the money." Sharon's expression flickered for just a moment, something that might have been shame, but then the hardness returned. "Get out of my way." The vote of no confidence passed unanimously among the remaining board members. Margaret was appointed interim president, and she immediately made a motion to suspend all enforcement actions until the fine review committee could be established. That passed unanimously as well. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. An independent audit firm was hired to review the HOA's finances. The audit confirmed everything I'd suspected. The contracts with Sharon's family members were massively inflated, proper bidding procedures hadn't been followed, and fine revenue had been deliberately increased to pad the budget. But the audit also found something worse. Sharon had been directly receiving kickbacks from both companies. 10% of every payment to Desert Bloom or Aqua Solutions had been funneled back to her through a shell company. Over 18 months, she'd personally pocketed almost $40,000 from HOA funds. That's when I called the Henderson Police Department. Detective Sarah Williams took my statement, reviewed the audit, and opened an investigation. Nevada takes HOA fraud seriously, especially when it involves embezzlement. Within a week, Detective Williams had subpoenaed records from the landscaping and pool companies, both of which quickly turned on Sharon to save themselves from charges. Sharon Whitmore was arrested on a Friday morning in late April. I wasn't there, but several neighbors saw her being led out of her house in handcuffs. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her brother-in-law and cousin were charged as accessories. The local news picked up the story. HOA president arrested for embezzlement ran on every station. Reporters interviewed homeowners who'd been targeted with frivolous fines. The The story gained traction because it fit a narrative people already believed about HOA overreach and petty tyrants with too much power. I didn't give any interviews. I'd done what needed to be done, but I didn't want to be the face of the story. This was about the neighborhood coming together to stop corruption, not about me personally. The legal proceedings took months. Sharon initially pleaded not guilty, claiming she'd done nothing wrong and that the payments from the companies were legitimate consulting fees. But the evidence was overwhelming. The shell company had no business purpose except to receive payments from Desert Bloom and Aqua Solutions. The timing of the payments correlated directly with HOA payments to those companies, and both company owners testified that Sharon had demanded the kickbacks as a condition of keeping the contracts. In September, Sharon accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud. The sentence was 2 years in prison followed by probation, plus full restitution of the stolen money and all improperly assessed fines. Her brother-in-law and cousin received probation and fines, having cooperated with investigators. The restitution process took even longer. A committee reviewed every fine issued during Sharon's tenure as president. Legitimate fines for things like unpaid dues or actual covenant violations were upheld, but over 150 fines were deemed inappropriate or retaliatory and were refunded. I got back every penny of the fines I'd been assessed, including the original $250 for my frozen fountain. The HOA held elections in October. Margaret was elected president officially, having served as interim president since Sharon's removal. The new board implemented reforms, requiring competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000, prohibiting board members from voting on matters where they had conflicts of interest, and establishing an appeals process for fines that didn't require appearing before the same board that issued them. The Johnsons, who'd considered moving after being harassed with fines, decided to stay. So did the Hendersons. Several families who'd been quietly suffering under Sharon's reign actually thanked me for standing up to her, saying they'd wanted to do something but were afraid of being targeted. My fountain ran beautifully through the spring and summer. In November, the weather forecast called for another cold snap, though not as severe as the previous year. I shut down the fountain proactively, following the same procedures I'd used before. This time, no one fined me. The neighborhood actually felt like a community again. People attended board meetings not out of fear, but because they wanted to be involved. The new landscaping company, selected through proper competitive bidding, did excellent work for 40% less than what we'd been paying Desert Bloom. The pool was open more consistently and properly maintained. In December, almost a year after the frozen fountain incident, I ran into Patricia from the management office at a coffee shop. She was no longer working for Riverside Meadows HOA, having taken a job with a different management company. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said after we'd chatted for a few minutes. "Sharon could have been a good HOA president if she'd just been reasonable. The neighborhood didn't need a dictator. It needed someone who could organize events and make sure basic maintenance got done. But she was so obsessed with control and making money that she destroyed everything." "Some people can't handle even small amounts of power," I said. "I'm glad you stood up to her. A lot of people wanted to but didn't know how. You showing up with documentation and legal backing, that gave everyone else courage." I thought about that conversation later while sitting in my backyard, watching the fountain I'd fought so hard to defend. The whole thing seemed almost absurd in retrospect. A fine for a frozen fountain had led to uncovering embezzlement, a criminal prosecution, and reforms that benefited hundreds of families. But it also reminded me of something important. Institutions, Even small ones like homeowner associations only work when people are willing to hold leaders accountable. Sharon had gotten away with her scheme for 18 months because most people didn't want to make waves. They paid the fines, followed the rules, and hoped they wouldn't be targeted next. Standing up to that kind of abuse takes effort and courage. It meant dealing with certified letters, attending boring meetings, spending weekends reviewing financial records, and risking retaliation. But the alternative was letting someone corrupt have free rein to harass people and steal from them. As water commissioner, I dealt with infrastructure and regulations that affected hundreds of thousands of people. I understood systems, accountability, and proper procedures. That knowledge had served me well in fighting the HOA, but any homeowner could have done the same thing with enough determination. The tools were available, information was accessible, and the law was on the side of the honest homeowners. I thought about the fountain's history now, approved and installed properly, frozen during unusual weather, used as an excuse for retaliation, and ultimately vindicated when the truth came out. It was just a decorative water feature, but it had become a symbol of something larger, the importance of standing up for what's right even over something small. The holidays approached, and the neighborhood decorated enthusiastically. No one worried about having lights up a day too late or a decoration an inch too tall. The new board had revised the covenant to focus on genuine issues like abandoned properties or actual safety hazards, rather than the petty micromanagement Sharon had enforced. At the annual holiday party in mid-December, hosted at the community center, Margaret gave a speech thanking the volunteers who'd helped reform the HOA. She specifically mentioned my willingness to challenge unfair practices and bring corruption to light. People applauded, which felt both gratifying and slightly embarrassing. I just didn't want to pay a fine for something I couldn't control, I said when people congratulated me afterward. But you didn't just fight for yourself, Linda Johnson pointed out. You fought for all of us. That matters. She was right. When I'd first received that fine for the frozen fountain, I'd been angry primarily for myself. It seemed unfair, and I had the knowledge to prove it. But as I dug deeper and discovered the pattern of abuse and corruption, it had become about something bigger. Every bogus fine, every act of retaliation, every dollar embezzled was an injustice not just to one person, but to the entire community. The Nevada Attorney General's office had also taken interest in the case. They'd launched a broader investigation into HOA corruption across the state, using Sharon's case as an example of what to look for. Changes to state law were being proposed to increase transparency requirements and make it easier for homeowners to challenge abusive practices. I testified at a legislative hearing in Carson City in January, explaining how the lack of oversight had allowed Sharon to operate unchecked for so long. Lawmakers listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the scheme and what reforms might prevent similar situations. The problem isn't HOAs themselves, I told the committee. The problem is when boards operate without accountability. Simple reforms, mandatory audits, clear conflict of interest rules, accessible dispute resolution, these things would prevent most abuses. The legislation eventually passed, incorporating many of the suggestions from homeowners who dealt with corrupt boards. It wouldn't solve every problem, but it would make it harder for the next Sharon Whitmore to exploit her position. Back in Riverside Meadows, life returned to normal. I focused on my work at the water department, implementing new conservation programs and upgrading aging infrastructure. Frank Martinez and I worked on a comprehensive drought response plan, knowing that water management would only become more critical in the coming years. My fountain continued to operate perfectly through winter and into spring. When temperatures dropped, I shut it down properly. When they rose, I turned it back on. No fines appeared. No threatening letters arrived. The simple pleasure of hearing water cascading into the basin while sitting on my front porch became just that, a simple pleasure, not a source of stress and conflict. Tom Henderson's wife recovered from her cancer treatment. He threw a party in July to celebrate, and half the neighborhood showed up. People brought food and drinks, kids played in the pool, and someone set up a volleyball net in the park. Sharon Whitmore's name never came up in conversation. She'd been erased from the neighborhood's consciousness, a bad memory that people had moved past. I talked with Mark Johnson during the party, standing near the grill where he was cooking burgers. "You ever think about running for the board?" he asked. "People would vote for you in a heartbeat after everything you did." "Not interested," I said honestly. "I have enough responsibility at work. I just want to come home, relax, and not worry about someone measuring my grass." "Fair enough, but the option's there if you change your mind." I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. Fighting corruption when necessary was one thing, but seeking out positions of authority over neighbors wasn't appealing. I'd seen what that kind of power could do to people. Better to stay engaged as a regular homeowner, attending meetings when issues arose, but otherwise living my life. The fountain became something of a neighborhood landmark after the whole ordeal. Parents would walk past with kids and tell the story of how the frozen fountain had brought down a corrupt HOA president. The details got exaggerated in the retelling, as stories do, but the core truth remained. Someone had stood up to abuse of power, and it had made a difference. In August, I received a letter from the Nevada Association of Municipal Water Commissioners recognizing my work in both professional capacity and community service. Apparently, using my professional expertise to expose fraud and improve governance had caught the attention of colleagues across the state. The letter noted that water commissioners had unique knowledge about infrastructure and systems that could benefit their communities in multiple ways. That fall, I was invited to speak at a conference about HOA governance. I shared the story of the frozen fountain, the investigation, and the reforms that followed. The audience included homeowners from across Nevada who were dealing with their own HOA problems, some eerily similar to what we'd experienced. "The key is documentation," I told them. "Keep records of everything. If something seems wrong, it probably is, and you need evidence to prove it." HOA boards rely on homeowners being too busy or too intimidated to challenge them. The moment you show up with facts, documentation, and knowledge of the law, the power dynamic shifts. People lined up afterward to ask questions and share their own stories. A woman from Reno described a board president who'd embezzled over $100,000. A man from Las Vegas talked about a board that had fined him repeatedly for running a home business, even though his business was entirely online and didn't violate any actual rules. The problems were widespread, and the solutions were similar: transparency, accountability, and willingness to fight back. Sharon Whitmore served 15 months of her 2-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard about it through neighborhood gossip, but didn't pay much attention. She'd sold her house in Riverside Meadows to pay restitution and moved to a different part of the state. Her brother-in-law and cousin had shut down their companies after the scandal, unable to get new contracts with the cloud of fraud hanging over them. Justice had been served, not perfectly but adequately. The stolen money had been returned. The fines had been refunded. The reforms had been implemented. Sharon had faced consequences for her actions. That was more than many people got when dealing with institutional corruption. 2 years after the frozen fountain incident, in January again, Henderson experienced another cold snap. This one was even more severe, with temperatures dropping to 25 degrees for 3 consecutive nights. The municipal water department issued advisories. Residents protected their pipes, and outdoor water features froze across the city, including my fountain. This time, when ice formed in the basin and frost covered the decorative stonework, I took a photo and posted it to the neighborhood social media page with a simple caption: "Mother Nature decorating the fountain. Will resume normal operations when it thaws." The responses were immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People posted pictures of their own frozen water features, bird baths turned into ice sculptures, and ponds with frozen surfaces. Someone made a joke about forming a support group for people whose decorative features had been assaulted by weather. Another person posted a mock fine notice, complete with official-looking formatting, charging Mother Nature $250 for improper maintenance. Margaret commented, "No fines will be issued for weather. Enjoy the temporary ice sculptures." That summed up the change in the neighborhood perfectly. What had once been a source of conflict and stress was now just a minor inconvenience accompanied by humor and community solidarity. The covenant still existed, rules still mattered, but they were enforced reasonably by people who understood that perfection wasn't possible, and that natural occurrences weren't violations. Standing in my front yard, looking at the frozen fountain on a cold January morning, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the water feature itself. The fight had been worth it, not because of any personal victory, but because an entire community was better off. Hundreds of families could live in their homes without fear of petty harassment. Money was being spent appropriately on actual services rather than lining someone's pockets. And people had learned that standing up to corruption, even in something as mundane as a homeowner association, made a real difference. The fountain thawed over the next few days as temperatures rose back to normal Nevada winter levels. I turned the pump back on, checked for any damage from the freeze, found none, and resumed enjoying the peaceful sound of flowing water. It was just a fountain again, not a symbol or a battleground, and that was exactly how it should be.